Main Street branch in Harlem. It's about an hour.
Good afternoon. Welcome to 115th Street Branch Library. My name is Jabu Masikela. I'm the branch librarian here in 115th Street. I'm also the adult specialist. I'm responsible for the programming that we have in the branch. This is quite a usual programming situation for us. We always have guest speakers here to come to reach out to the library, to the community, and to share their experiences with our patrons on whatever materials they have out there that is being published. As part of the New York is Book Country Weekend, we do have the distinct pleasure this afternoon of having a very special young man, Mr. Philippe Wamba, who has written a very wonderful book entitled Kinship. It is a particularly interesting book that weaves all the things that bind African Americans and Africans together. He has woven a wonderful tapestry of the politics, the economics, the culture, the music, the push and pull of Africa that makes us all such a wonderful and I think particularly beautiful people. I'm going to bring Mr. Philippe Wamba onto the podium in a moment, but I want to remind all of you who are here present that we do this on a regular basis. On Tuesday night at 6 o'clock, we'll be having Mr. Gil Noble coming to talk about his experiences producing Like It Is for the past 20 some odd years. And our next author who will be coming is a new author who's written a book called Slapboxing with Jesus, Mr. Laval. And he will be here in November. So please make a note for our next reading, which will be in November, and another reminder for Gil Noble on Tuesday at 6 p.m. We also have our book discussion in the region, and our fall discussion series starts again on Tuesday. And the book discussion will be Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. So without much more from me, I would like you all to please give a warm welcome to our speaker for this afternoon, Mr. Philippe Wamba.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for coming. I'm glad you made it here. The book is called Kinship, Family's Journey in Africa and America. And the family in the title that it refers to my personal family, my extended family, which is partly in Africa, partly in this country. My mother, she's from Michigan, the Midwest, and my father's from the Congo. And I grew up both in the United States and also in Tanzania in East Africa. But it also refers to this idea of an international black family, as this idea of kinship in an international Pan-African sense. So this book uses my own family story as a starting point, but it gets into a broader history of black relations, African and African-American relations, and talks about different medium. So I wanted to read from the book to touch on some of the other experiences that the book explores, and to talk about some other Africans throughout history who have dealt with some of the same issues and have explored this idea of kinship in interesting ways. So I'll read, and then we can take some questions and answers. Hopefully we'll have a discussion. Hope surged in Kunta. Would the black ones free him now? But he no sooner thought of it than the flame lit their faces as they stood looking at him over the sides of the wagon. They were laughing at him. What kind of blacks were these who looked down upon their own kind and worked like goats for the Tubab? Where had they come from? They looked as Africans looked, but clearly they were not of Africa. Alex Haley, Roots. When Kunta Kinte, perhaps America's best-known African transplant, had his first contact with American-born blacks, he was confounded, confused, and mystified. Kinte's experience as a Mandinka youth abducted in Africa and enslaved in America are artfully explored by Alex Haley in Roots, a painstakingly researched but largely reconstructed account of the author's family history from Kunta's childhood in the Gambia through the Middle Passage, slavery, Reconstruction, and several generations. While mainly fictionalized, Haley's convincing and deeply moving narrative depends on historical research to depict the experience of slavery from Kinte's perspective and rings true in its imagination of his sufferings, trials, and triumphs as a despairing yet defiant young slave in 18th century Virginia. Kunta initially felt race-based kinship with the black American slaves he met, but then came to see them as different from himself because of their seeming support for his white oppressors and also because their cultural practices were different from his own. And this tension between his strong sense of identification with American blacks and simultaneous hopeless alienation from them plagued Kunta for years. As he adapted to his new environment and he came to resign himself to his condition of servitude, shared loneliness drove him to establish friendships with some of the slaves on his plantation, and though he became grateful for the company, the differences between his new friend's background and his own often seemed an insurmountable obstacle. After more than a decade in Virginia, Kunta came to accept that after generations spent in America, the blacks there had become culturally distinct from Africans. And with horror, he was forced to confront his own gradual alienation from the cultural traditions into which he was born. He began to lose his grasp of the Mandinka language, and though he never ate pork, he gradually became more and more lax in his maintenance of Islamic customs. He became more and more acculturated to his plantation environment and eventually became an integral member of the black slave community, marrying into it, learning its language and traditions. But he never forgot his original homeland and never lost the Africanness that set him apart from his African-American peers. Kunta Kinte's fictionalized experience as a transplanted African followed a pattern that closely resembles actual accounts by African slaves in the Americas. They describe a process of identification, alienation, and eventual assimilation. In more recent eras, the circumstances under which Africans travel to America have changed significantly, but in many ways this process has endured. Many Africans arriving in the United States identify with American black communities readily and seemingly automatically, but often end up having to reassess their relationship to African Americans. And many African U.S. arrivals ultimately succeed in establishing positive ties to or integrating themselves within black American communities, even if more recent African experiences with African Americans are sometimes as confounding as were those of their predecessors in centuries past. Ota Benga, a pygmy from the forests of Congo, was one African traveler who explored America around the turn of the century, and like Haley's Kinte, found himself having to negotiate the tension between finding a home in America's black communities and feeling excluded from them. Benga was born into a communal pygmy clan in the Congo Free State and captured by African slave catchers as a young man. He was purchased by S.P. Werner, an American missionary and explorer traveling in Congo on a mission to find a group of pygmies to exhibit at the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis. The way Werner later told it, Benga agreed to travel to St. Louis with him and several other pygmy men and created a sensation as the star of the fair's anthropology exhibit, a collection of representatives of various non-white ethnic groups from around the world. Benga and his peers were impressed by the technological resources and infrastructure of the white man's country, but resented being exhibited like animals for the amusement of huge crowds of prodding white people. They were relieved when the fair closed after 4 months, during which they had been housed in authentic huts and gaped at by thousands of awestruck fairgoers. There is no record of how many American blacks attended the fair, and the pygmies did not apparently have any significant contact with African Americans while on display. Interestingly, though, a group of Zulus who were also exhibited at the fair rebelled after a dispute over their wages and are said to have escaped into the black community, never to be found. Werner returned his pygmy charges to Congo, but Benga, apparently curious enough about America to wish to explore it more fully, is said to have asked to return to the United States to learn more about the white man and his country. He was specifically interested in learning to read. With Werner as his initial guide, Benga embarked on a journey through America that would last for more than a decade. Unlike most African travelers to the New World before him, who were brought to America by force and prevented from leaving, Benga was evidently something of a tourist. He intended only to visit the United States, collecting impressions, knowledge, and experiences like snapshots and souvenirs, and to return home when he was ready. On this second trip to America, Benga first came into significant contact with American blacks as the focal point of a shameful spectacle that highlighted the racism and arrogance of earlier 20th century America. Werner, Benga's American host, fell on hard times and had difficulty gaining the recognition he had hoped for as an important African explorer and collector. While he sought employment, he housed Benga first at the New York Museum of Natural History and then at the Bronx Zoo. At the zoo, Benga, an authentic African anthropological curiosity, was eventually placed in a cage in the monkey house and exhibited as an exotic oddity, a primitive savage whose teeth were filed to a point and who wrestled with his chimpanzee cellmates. Crowds were amazed by his antics, and he quickly caused a sensation. He was easily the most popular attraction at the zoo for the duration of his stay in the monkey house. The few voices raised in protest at the idea of a human being displayed like an animal were rooted in the New York black community. A Baptist minister, the Reverend R.S. MacArthur, went to see the pygmy in the zoo for himself and registered outrage. The person responsible for this exhibition degrades himself as much as he does the African, he complained. Instead of making a beast of this little fellow, we should be putting him in school for the development of such powers as God gave him. We send our missionaries to Africa to Christianize the people, and then we bring one here to brutalize him. MacArthur and other black ministers vowed to see to it that Benga was released from his cage and housed elsewhere, and they demanded that the mayor and the zoo's director put an end to the exhibit. James Gordon, a minister and the administrator of a black orphanage in Brooklyn, denounced Benga's exhibition on the grounds that blacks were fed up with racist comparisons to monkeys, ideas that would only damage black self-esteem and that were an obstacle to black self-improvement. Our race, we think, is depressed enough without exhibiting us with one of the apes, he said. We think we are worthy of being considered human beings with souls. You people are on top. We've got to rise. Why not let us and not impede us? Why show that Negroes are akin to apes? Give us opportunities. He offered to let Benga stay in his orphanage or even in his own home and insisted that the pygmy no longer be caged. But he seems never to have explicitly challenged the idea that Benga was akin to an ape. There was another barely articulated reason why many blacks opposed the exhibition. Those who uncritically accepted the dominant view of Africans as primitive savages were uncomfortable at being associated with Benga. They worried that the exhibition of his backward ways would stigmatize all blacks. Proponents of this view, expressed in black newspapers like The Journal, pointed out that Benga was hardly representative of all Africans, much less of all blacks. The Journal was expressing an attitude common among American blacks, whose beliefs about Africa were tainted by decades of American propaganda that depicted Africa as an uncivilized wilderness. Many blacks sought to distance themselves from what they had been told was a barbarous place, a frighteningly foreign continent they saw personified in Benga, with his sharpened teeth and bow and arrow. Their embarrassment at his presence was similar to the discomfort some white aspiring upwardly mobile blacks felt when lower class blacks acted too black, too loud, too sensual, too uninhibited in the presence of whites. Unfortunately, however, even those blacks whom Benga did not embarrass seemed ready to accept the notion of his primitiveness. As pressure from black ministers mounted on the zoo authorities, Benga was eventually released and lodged in the Howard Colored Orphan Asylum in Brooklyn, where he was welcome as James Gordon's guest. Gordon aimed to civilize the pygmy by teaching him to read, write, and speak English. As far as I can see, this little black man is capable of development, he told reporters when Benga was released to his care. Indeed, he seems bright to me. We think we can do better for him than make an exhibition of him. It was never suggested that Benga, who was around 28 years old by now and an accomplished hunter, tracker, and herbalist, might already be developed, or that he was anything other than primitive. Thus, when the African traveler was finally adopted by a New York black community, it was so that they could civilize him. Ministers like Gordon were willing to recognize a kinship between Benga and American blacks, but most felt that their duty to their African cousin involved teaching him to be an American. In fact, Gordon felt that Benga would serve as an important test case in the eyes of white America. If he could educate the pygmy, it would demonstrate American blacks' worthiness of equal access to education and social services. For if an African primitive could be Christianized and domesticated, transformed from a heathen savage into a civilized and productive Westerner, so the reasoning went, then surely more evolved American blacks deserved the full rights of citizenship. Despite his good intentions, Gordon's efforts to educate and civilize Benga were less than successful. He learned some English, he learned to write a few words, voluntarily underwent a Christian baptism that did little to change his behavior and outlook, and even came to enjoy playing baseball. But that was essentially the extent of his Americanization. Gordon finally gave up trying to reform him. His age was against his development, bemoaned the minister. It was simply impossible to put him in a class to receive instructions from a literary point that would be of any advantage to him. In fact, Benga's example threatened to subvert the orphanage's order and disrupted discipline. He became so popular among the institution's boys that when he dropped out of classes, some of the other students wished to follow him. Benga had spent one semester of his time at the orphanage studying at a Baptist seminary in Lynchburg, Virginia. Gordon was probably relieved when Benga decided to return to the South. In Lynchburg, Benga continued to strike a precarious balance between assimilating into the black community that welcomed him and retaining the distinctive Africanness that set him apart from it. He occasionally attended classes at the Lynchburg Seminary. At his host's encouragement, he had his sharpened teeth capped, and his name was gradually Americanized into Otto Bingo. Curious strangers were told he was from New York. But while he usually lived in town, ran errands, and even worked for a time in the local tobacco factory to earn money, Benga spent much of his time in the Virginia woods, hunting the local game, puffing on marijuana he cultivated there, gathering plants, dressing himself in a bark loincloth, and performing the dances of his youth around a campfire. Sometimes he was accompanied by neighborhood children, and he would often instruct them in the finer points of pygmy culture. In short, Benga sought to reproduce elements of the culture he was born into on American soil. Yet at the Lynchburg Seminary, Benga also forged friendships with some of the most prominent black leaders of the era. The seminary's lead director, Dr. Gregory Hayes, was a leading black educator and an early proponent of Pan-Africanism and became a close friend of Benga's. Hayes, along with John Chilembwe, an African who had studied at the seminary in the 1890s, had helped found the African Development Society, which sought to mobilize African-American support for African political and economic independence. Benga also established a close relationship with Anne Spencer, a black poet who contributed significantly to the literary flowering of the Harlem Renaissance. Spencer's work and its outspoken defiance in the face of Jim Crow segregation earned her the friendship of other black leaders, and through her, Benga was introduced to W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. In Lynchburg, Benga hobnobbed with the elite of the American black community, all the while maintaining a part-time pygmy lifestyle in the woods outside town. Despite seeming to have mastered this sort of selective assimilation, and despite appearing to have adjusted to life in Lynchburg and being surrounded by supportive friends, apparently Benga became more and more unhappy. It's important to remember that he had always intended to return home once he had had his fill of traveling in the land of the whites. Benga had assumed that Werner would help him to find his way home, but he had lost contact with Werner before he left New York. Benga must have despaired of ever making his way back to the Congolese forest. He checked the price of steamship passage to Africa and returned disheartened, realizing he was unable to afford the voyage. Desperately homesick and telling no one of his intent, Benga acquired a revolver and set out for his woodland retreat. After one last dance around a campfire, he turned the white man's weapon on himself. Ota Benga's biography by Harvey Bloom and Phillips Werner Bradford, a descendant of Benga's missionary companion, is unavoidably flawed in that, based on Werner's own writings and secondary source material, it is unable to present events from Benga's perspective. How did he really feel about life in America? What did he really think of his friend Werner? When he posed for photographs, grinning to show off his sharpened incisors for titillated audiences, what was going through his head? Who was really mocking whom? And what were his perceptions of this tribe of Africans displaced in America, the people among whom he lived at the end of his life? We will never know the answers to these questions, but however successfully Benga appeared to have settled in Lynchburg, clearly his new friends and home could not provide him the emotional support and solace he needed to live. Even though Benga was embraced by a black community that practically considered him one of its own, there had been social costs for his acceptance, and he felt isolated and lonely enough to prefer death to life away from home. His friend Ann Spencer had trouble explaining his suicide to her son, who had often accompanied the pygmy on hunting trips in the woods. But eventually she told him that Benga had sent his spirit home to Africa